Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling today's hearing. And Chairman Powell, thank you for coming before us today, and thanks for your service to our country. Earlier this year, we had the chairs of the Federal Reserve, former chairs, Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen, come before our committee. I would venture to say, Chairman Powell, that the challenges you faced during your tenure far exceed things that we've seen from previous Fed chairmen. And as we work together through this, I just want to thank you for keeping a steady hand at the Federal Reserve, which has been so important as we start seeing this economic recovery. China, Mr. Chairman, has long declared a goal of overtaking the United States, both economically and militarily. At the outset of this pandemic, China lied about the emergence of the most dangerous virus we've seen in over 100 years. China refused to allow American scientists into their country to help assess the threat, despite the fact that many scientists within China were asking for our help. I was in some of those meetings at the White House with Dr. Fauci and others when the Trump administration was trying to get our best doctors into China to find out what was happening. And it was the Chinese Communist Party who refused our ability to find that out. At the same time, China was closing down domestic travel. They were sending thousands of people a day overseas, including here into the United States, setting the table for this global pandemic. In the months of January and February, China hoarded medical PPE. The Chinese Communist Party actually banned the exports of surgical gloves, masks, and gowns to the United States so that they could hoard PPE for themselves while they lied to the rest of the world about COVID-19's threats and dangers. China not only covered up an emerging pandemic, they also spread the pandemic and made sure that the rest of the world was not prepared to thwart the virus. Still to this day, this House majority calls China's role in this pandemic a distraction. The majority has held 0 hearings on China's role. We've had celebrities testify before our committee, but yet we can't get the Chinese ambassador, as we've called for multiple times, to come and testify before this committee. We cannot fully understand this pandemic and the impact it's had on the American people without understanding the role of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government in this cover-up. But let's start with where America was prior to COVID. Prior to COVID-19, the economy added jobs every single month since the election of President Trump. Prior to COVID-19, since the president's election, the economy's added more than 7 million jobs. This is more than the entire population of the state of Massachusetts in 2018. This is 5.1 million more jobs than the Congressional Budget Office projected in its final forecast before the 2016 election. In 2019, real median household income increased by more than $4,000 per household, reaching an all-time high of $68,700 of household income. This represents a 6.8% one-year increase, which is the largest one-year increase in median income on record. As income grew by $4,379 per family in 2019, this represents more than the entire median income gains during the whole 8 years of the previous administration, by more than $1,300 per family. Poverty also hit a record low in 2019. The official poverty rate fell to an all-time record low of 10.5%, and more than 4 million people were lifted out of poverty between 2018 and 2019 for a 1.3 percentage point decrease. This was the largest reduction in poverty in more than 50 years. Minority groups led the way in the alleviation of poverty. Compared to the overall poverty rate reduction of 1.3%, Black poverty fell by 2 percentage points. Hispanic poverty fell by 1.8 percentage points, and Asian poverty fell by 2.8 percentage points. The poverty rate fell to an all-time record low for every race and ethnic group in 2019. The Black poverty rate fell below 20% for the first time in history. Between the time President Trump took office in February 2020, African American employment increased by 1.3 million jobs. And then the virus hit our shores. And President Trump listened to the experts. In fact, President Trump did take and continues to take decisive action, carrying out a plan that is saving American lives, carrying out a plan that is getting us on the verge of multiple, not one, but multiple vaccines for COVID-19. That is a successful plan. Now, if you want to start with the first decisive action, as we finally found out, despite China's lies, what was coming in from China, not just to America, but all around the world. First thing President Trump did is made a critical, decisive decision. He banned flights from China. There were critics. We know who many of them are, using terms like xenophobia and other things. But yet President Trump was steadfast because he listened to his scientists. In fact, Dr. Fauci testified from that very chair you're sitting in, Chairman Powell, just a few weeks ago before this committee, that President Trump's decision on that and so many other decisions along the way carrying out his plan was the right decision, and that President Trump's plan saved American lives. Of course, the president made other decisions. He banned travel from Europe once we realized that while flights were not allowed in from China, people from other decision. But the right decision, according to all the scientists, he banned flights from Europe. Then the president instituted the 15 days to stop the spread plan, which again, Dr. Fauci from that chair just a few weeks ago testified under oath that that was not only the right decision, but that decision saved American lives, as did the subsequent decision the president made to extend for another 30 days, and so many other decisions that we've seen this president make. We put the strongest economy in American history on its self-induced coma. The pain was real. 40% of the job losses occurred among people making less than $40,000 a year. In my home state of Louisiana, almost 45% of the accommodation and food service workforce had lost their jobs, an industry dominated by low-income workers. Under President Trump's leadership, Congress responded in a bipartisan way. We passed the CARES Act. We came together to help those small businesses, to help those families who were struggling, to help those hospitals who were struggling, and yes, also to help those states who were struggling. It put your team to work, Chairman Powell, working on carrying out this recovery plan. While the Main Street Lending Facility program has perhaps taken a slightly different path than originally anticipated, the Fed provided a needed backstop and injected much-needed liquidity at a critical moment. The United States had the smallest economic contraction of any major Western economy in the first half of this year during this pandemic. And now America has begun this next great American recovery. Total non-farm payroll employment rose by 1.4 million jobs in August, with the record-breaking job gains in May and in June and in July, and now in August. This economy has added more than 10.5 million new jobs just in the last 4 months. We can talk about those numbers. We can also talk about how much more we need to go. But a plan that's created over 10 million jobs to get that economy back going is the right direction we need to be heading. The unemployment rate ticked down by 1.8 percentage points to 8.4 in August, beating market expectations. African-American employment has increased by 1.3 million jobs from the record that we saw. So how do we keep this great American economic recovery on track? I first want to emphasize a point that Chairman Powell made in your testimony yesterday. Quote, "Our economy will recover fully from this difficult period." Talked about that yesterday. I'm sure we're going to talk about that more today. The chairman also testified yesterday that, quote, "The path forward will depend on keeping the virus under control and on policy actions taken at all government levels." Now, one of those areas in terms of keeping the virus under control, because clearly this has been a critical component of the president's plan, is to get a vaccine. As you know, Chairman Powell, as the members of this committee know, we have 3 different groups of very well-respected, internationally respected drug companies that are in final testing in phase 3 of FDA testing for a vaccine. And we don't know when this will complete. We don't know if all 3, 1, 2, maybe all 3, will get approved by the FDA. But never in our history have we seen 1, let alone 3 vaccines on the brink of actually being approved by the FDA in this quick of a period of time. And why is it? It's not by accident. It's because of the president's plan. It's called Operation Warp Speed that's brought us to this point. Some of that is money that we voted on in a bipartisan way from the CARES Act, that we allowed the FDA, CDC, and other agencies to have increased ability to go out and encourage the development of a vaccine. No corners being cut. Critical point. No corners have been cut. We've heard from many of the top scientists working on this just how detailed this is, just how many people, thousands, tens of thousands of Americans who signed up. I want to congratulate and thank, by the way, Mr. Chairman, the 250,000 plus Americans who've signed up to participate in these trials. It's unprecedented that Americans from all walks of life have stood up and said, I'm willing to be a part of these trials so that we can get a vaccine that will save American lives. I am concerned, Mr. Chairman, that there are some people that are trying to undermine the public confidence in this process. You started to see it just last week. Some politicians, for their own personal benefit, trying to put doubt in the heads of people whether or not this process is going to yield a safe and effective drug. There ought to be no doubt. There ought to be nobody trying to use politics to interfere with this process. The highest integrity, not just in America, but in the world, is taking place at the FDA. FDA is the gold standard for the world at testing and approving drugs. And no one has suggested that that process has been compromised. I challenge anybody to name one company on this list that would cut corners or speed up the process that involves putting a drug in your body just because they're trying to help some candidate for political office. That's a ridiculous and dangerous notion. That kind of attempt to reduce public confidence would cost American lives. And so let's follow the science. Let's let the FDA run its course. If a drug or 2 or 3 or more get approved, vaccines, therapies, we ought to celebrate that. We ought to applaud that and encourage people to listen to their doctor. Ultimately, that's a discussion between them and their doctor about whether or not they should take this. But let that process move forward without further corruption. And again, I applaud the president for the work he's done to put all of these plans in place, to lay out through CDC how schools can safely reopen. We need to encourage all elements of our economy to safely reopen. It can be done. Some are choosing to do it, and some at the local level are choosing not to do it. We've seen and we've heard testimony about the devastating impact on children. For example, when a local school system makes the decision not to safely reopen for in-school learning. It can be done safely. The guidelines are there all around. Some are choosing to do it and some aren't, but there's consequences to those children. There's consequences when economies are shut down. And we're seeing death rates, unfortunately, go up in other areas because people are losing their jobs, losing their way of life, companies that are collapsing. We've got a bill, Mr. Chairman. I brought this to the majority leader's attention. Congressman Shabbat from Ohio filed a bill to take the remaining PPP money. We've got $138 billion remaining in the Paycheck Protection Program, sitting idle in a bank account because the program expired. It was a highly successful program. It wasn't a Republican program or a Democrat program. We all voted on it. And it had unbelievable success, over 50 million jobs that have been created. And yet there are many of those businesses that are still struggling today that want to get back up and running that could use a second lifeline. And we have the money to do it. And what Congressman Shabbat's bill does is frees up that $138 billion so that those small businesses who are actually having a decline in their sales, some are increased in their sales, but some are declined, let those businesses that are still struggling go a second round with that money that's sitting idle in a bank account. I would hope that the majority would bring that bill to the floor. It has tremendous bipartisan support. Article in the Hill today talking about a number of Democrats who are very interested in that bill, and yet we're not allowed to get a hearing on that bill on the House floor. We could come together and get that done. I know there are bigger issues that are being negotiated, But that negotiation's been going on for weeks. Let's take a program we already agree on and at least give a lifeline to those small businesses who are struggling while we work to get this great economic recovery back on track. Look forward to your testimony, Mr. Chairman, and with that, yield back the balance of my time.